A botanist studying ancient redwoods found a tree that shouldn't exist. 50 mirrors spiraling up its trunk, each one reflecting light in a different direction. And at the base, a wedding ring nailed above a message that read, "I'll keep reflecting." The message was signed with a single letter, but when forensic teams analyzed the handwriting, they discovered something impossible. The mirrors were installed over a span of 6 days, yet the man had been reported missing on day 1. The discovery was made on October 14, 2019, deep in the Redwood National Park backcountry. A graduate student named Marcus Chen was conducting a routine survey of old-growth forest density when his GPS malfunctioned. He decided to continue on foot, using compass bearings. That's when he saw it, a massive coastal redwood, at least 800 years old, wrapped in an ascending spiral of small rectangular mirrors. Each mirror was roughly the size of a paperback book. They caught the afternoon sun and threw it in 50 different directions, creating a dizzying constellation of light beams across the forest floor. Marcus approached slowly. He'd spent 3 years studying these woods and had never seen anything remotely like this. At the base of the tree, hammered into the thick bark with a railroad spike, was a simple gold wedding band. Below it, carved directly into the wood with what appeared to be a hunting knife, were 4 words and an initial, "I'll keep reflecting." Marcus took photos. He called his supervisor. Within 3 hours, park rangers and county sheriff deputies were on site. By nightfall, the area was cordoned off. The mirrors were fastened with climbing hardware, carabiners, rope, military-grade adhesive. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this installation. But why? And who was H? The answer came quickly. Too quickly. A missing person report had been filed 6 days earlier. Howard Milliken, age 42, research botanist with the California Academy of Sciences. His car had been found abandoned at a trailhead 11 miles from the mirrored tree. His wallet, phone, and field journal were still inside. His wife, Rebecca Milliken, had reported him missing after he failed to return from what was supposed to be a 2-day solo research trip. Howard's specialty was old-growth redwood ecosystem mapping. He'd been working on a long-term project documenting the health and connectivity of ancient tree groves. It was lonely work. It required spending days alone in the forest, taking core samples, measuring canopy density, recording fungal networks. Howard was good at being alone. Some would say too good. When park rangers showed Rebecca the photos of the mirrored tree, she went silent. She stared at the image of the wedding ring for nearly a full minute. Then she said something that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "That's his ring. He stopped wearing it 4 months ago." The investigation began in earnest. Search teams combed a 12-mile radius around the tree. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the canopy. Divers checked nearby creeks. Nothing. Howard Milliken had vanished, but the mirrors remained, reflecting light into the empty forest as if waiting for someone to see. The forensic analysis of the site yielded more questions than answers. The handwriting carved into the bark was confirmed as Howard's. The wedding ring was his. DNA traces on the climbing gear matched his profile. But here's what didn't make sense. The installation of the mirrors would have required at least 6 days of continuous work, drilling anchor points, setting ropes, climbing and repositioning, applying adhesive and allowing it to cure, adjusting angles for optimal light reflection. It was meticulous, methodical, obsessive, yet Howard had been reported missing on day 1. His car was found abandoned on October 8th. The mirrored tree was discovered on October 14th. If Howard installed the mirrors himself, he would have needed to start before he was reported missing, which meant he'd been planning this, preparing for it. But preparing for what? Rebecca provided a timeline. Howard had left their home in San Francisco on the morning of October 6th. He'd told her he was heading to the park for a routine data collection trip. He'd packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried food, water filtration system, field equipment. He'd kissed her goodbye. He'd promised to call when he got signal on October 8th. He never did. She'd waited until the evening of October 8th before calling the park service. By October 9th, his car had been located. By October 10th, she was in the park, walking search grids with volunteers. She spent 5 days looking for him. 5 days sleeping in a motel near the park entrance, waking before dawn, returning after dark, covered in mud and scratches. She found nothing. The question everyone was asking, How did Howard install 50 mirrors over 6 days when he was missing from day one? The only logical answer was that he wasn't missing. He was working, hidden somewhere in the forest, avoiding search parties, dedicating every daylight hour to his spiral of mirrors. But why would he do that? And where was he now? Detectives began digging into Howard's life. What they found was a man slowly coming apart at the seams. Colleagues described him as brilliant but increasingly withdrawn. In the months before his disappearance, he'd become obsessed with what he called forest signaling systems. He believed that old-growth trees communicated through more than just fungal networks. He thought they used light, reflected light, refracted light. He'd written dozens of pages in his field journals about photonic messaging and canopy mirrors. Most of his colleagues dismissed it as fringe science. Some worried it was something worse. His relationship with Rebecca had deteriorated. Friends described tension, arguments, long silences. Rebecca admitted they'd been sleeping in separate rooms for 2 months before his disappearance. She said Howard had become distant, paranoid. He accused her of not understanding his work. He'd stopped coming home some weekends, claiming he needed uninterrupted time in the field. She'd stopped asking where he went. 4 months before his disappearance, Howard had removed his wedding ring. He'd placed it on the kitchen counter one morning without explanation. Rebecca had asked him why. He'd looked at her and said, "I don't feel married anymore." She'd put the ring in a drawer. Neither of them mentioned it again. Now that ring was nailed to a tree 11 miles into the wilderness above a message that seemed equal parts promise and threat. "I'll keep reflecting." Psychologists brought in to consult on the case suggested Howard might have been experiencing a dissociative episode. The isolation, the obsessive focus on fringe theories, the symbolic gesture of returning the wedding ring. It painted a picture of a man losing his grip on reality, but it didn't explain the technical precision of the mirror installation. Dissociative episodes don't typically produce complex engineering projects. On October 21st, 1 week after the tree was discovered, a hiker found something. 3 miles north of the mirrored tree, in a dense thicket of ferns, there was a campsite. A small tent, barely visible under camouflage netting. Inside, a sleeping bag, portable stove, empty food wrappers, and a notebook. The notebook was filled with Howard's handwriting, pages and pages of calculations, mirror angles, sun trajectory charts, GPS coordinates, sketches of tree bark with numbered anchor points. It was a blueprint, a manual for building the spiral. The final entry was dated October 13th, 1 day before the tree was discovered. It read, "Tomorrow I finish. Then she'll see. Then she'll understand what it means to keep reflecting." The tent was empty, no sign of Howard, but search teams now had a direction. They expanded the search north, following a line projected from the mirror tree through the campsite. They walked slowly, checking every ravine, every cluster of boulders. They were looking for a body. Everyone knew it. No one said it. Rebecca joined the search. Detectives tried to convince her to stay behind, but she refused. She walked with the volunteers, silent and focused, her eyes scanning the forest floor. She looked like someone who'd already accepted the worst, and was simply waiting for confirmation. They found him on October 23rd, 2 miles north of the campsite, at the bottom of a steep embankment. Howard Milliken's body was wedged between 2 rocks, partially covered by fallen branches. He'd been dead for at least a week. The coroner would later determine the cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. He'd likely slipped while descending the embankment, struck his head, and died within minutes. It was an accident, a stupid, avoidable accident in a forest that had claimed dozens of lives over the years. But here's the part that didn't fit. Howard's body was found 2 miles north of his campsite. The mirrored tree was 3 miles south of the campsite. If Howard died in a fall on October 13th or earlier, how were the final mirrors installed? The forensic team had confirmed that several mirrors near the top of the spiral showed fresh adhesive. They'd been placed within the last 48 hours before discovery, after Howard was already dead. The answer, when it finally came, was both heartbreaking and obvious. Rebecca had installed the final mirrors. She'd found Howard's campsite days before the official search team. She'd read his notebook. She'd understood what he was trying to build, and she'd decided to finish it for him. Because despite everything, despite the distance and the arguments and the ring on the counter, she still loved him. and she understood that the spiral meant something to him, even if she didn't understand what. Rebecca confirmed it during a follow-up interview 3 weeks after Howard's funeral. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply said, "He wanted it finished, so I finished it." The detectives asked her why she didn't report finding the campsite, why she didn't tell anyone she'd been working on the tree. She looked at them and said, "Because you would have stopped me, and he deserved to have it completed." The timeline finally made sense. Howard had spent October 6th through 13th installing the first 43 mirrors, working alone obsessively, avoiding search parties that were looking for him. He'd been so focused on his project that he'd ignored the danger. On October 13th, after writing his final journal entry, he'd decided to scout a route north. Maybe he was looking for another tree. Maybe he just wanted to walk. He'd slipped on wet rocks, fallen, and died alone in the forest. Exactly the kind of death that claimed hikers every year in these woods. Rebecca had found his campsite on October 10th, 3 days before he died. She'd been searching alone, following a hunch based on areas Howard had mentioned in previous trips. She'd found the tent, the notebook, and the GPS coordinates for the tree. She'd hiked to it. She'd seen the incomplete spiral, the missing mirrors, and the upper sections. She'd understood immediately what Howard was trying to create: a monument, a signal, a message spelled out in reflected light. But she didn't tell anyone. Instead, she returned to her motel, bought climbing gear and mirrors from a hardware store 2 towns over, and went back to the tree. She worked in the early mornings before the official search parties arrived. She climbed. She drilled. She positioned mirrors according to Howard's diagrams. It took her 3 days to complete the final 7 mirrors. On October 13th, the same day Howard died, she installed the last one. She nailed his wedding ring to the base. She carved his message into the bark. And then she joined the search parties as if she'd been looking for him all along. She walked the grids. She called his name. She waited for someone else to find the tree so she wouldn't have to explain how she knew it was there. When Marcus Chen stumbled upon it on October 14th, Rebecca acted surprised, shocked, confused. She looked at the photos and lied about the ring. She let the investigation unfold. She waited for them to find Howard's body, and she never told anyone what she'd done. The question of why haunted everyone involved in the case. Why did Howard build the spiral? The answer was hidden in his journals, scattered across hundreds of pages of field notes. Howard hadn't just been studying trees. He'd been studying Rebecca, or more specifically, he'd been studying the way she stopped looking at him. In an entry dated 6 months before his disappearance, he wrote, "She used to reflect me back to myself. When I spoke, she listened in a way that made me feel seen. Now when I speak, it's like shouting into fog. Nothing comes back. I've become invisible." The mirrors weren't a scientific experiment. They were a metaphor made literal. A desperate attempt to be seen again, to reflect light back into the world in a way that couldn't be ignored, to create something so strange and beautiful and impossible that Rebecca would have no choice but to notice, to understand, to remember what it felt like when they reflected each other. But Howard never got to show her. He died alone on a rocky slope 2 miles from his masterpiece, probably thinking that he'd failed, that Rebecca would never see what he'd built, that the spiral would remain unfinished, a monument to a marriage that had slowly stopped reflecting. Rebecca knew better. She'd found the notebook. She'd read every entry. She understood that Howard hadn't been losing his mind. He'd been losing her, and in his own strange, obsessive way, he'd been trying to build a bridge back. The mirrors were that bridge. Incomplete, they were a failure. Completed, they were a promise kept. I'll keep reflecting, even when you can't see me, even when I'm gone. The Park Service debated what to do with the tree. Some argued the mirrors should be removed. Others said they should remain as a memorial. In the end, they left them. The spiral of 50 mirrors still stands in the backcountry of Redwood National Park, 800 feet of vertical reflection spiraling up a tree that was old when Columbus landed. Hikers occasionally find it. They take photos. They wonder what it means. Most never learn the story. Rebecca visits once a year. She hikes the 11 miles, alone, carrying fresh flowers and a thermos of coffee. She sits at the base of the tree for an hour. She doesn't speak. She doesn't cry. She just sits in the shifting patterns of reflected light, watching the forest illuminate itself in 50 directions, watching the world bounce back. The final piece of the puzzle emerged almost a year later, when a researcher studying Howard's field journals found a folded letter tucked into the back pages. It was addressed to Rebecca, dated October 12th. Howard had written it in his tent the night before he died. It was never mailed, never delivered. It simply existed, pressed between pages of tree measurements and fungal spore counts. The letter was short. It read, "Rebecca, I know I've been impossible. I know I've disappeared into my work. I know I stopped being the person you married. But I need you to know that everything I've ever studied, every tree I've ever measured, every hour I've spent in these woods, has been about trying to understand one simple thing: how to grow towards light even when you're surrounded by darkness. The trees do it. They find a way. I want to find a way back to you. I want to reflect the best parts of you back to yourself. I want to be seen again, and I want to see you again. Not the polite stranger we've become, but you, the person who laughed at terrible jokes and danced in the kitchen and believed I could do anything. I'm building something. When it's finished, I'll show you, and maybe then you'll understand. I'll keep reflecting. I promise." Rebecca never read that letter, not until almost a year after Howard's death. When the researcher called to tell her it existed, she asked him to read it aloud over the phone. She listened in silence. When he finished, she said thank you, and hung up. She didn't ask for the original. She didn't need to hold it. The words were already carved into her, deeper than any message carved into bark. The truth is this: Howard Milliken built a spiral of mirrors because he'd forgotten how to speak in ways that weren't metaphors. He'd spent so many years studying the silent language of trees that he'd lost the ability to simply say, "I'm scared, I love you, I don't know how to come back." So he built a monument instead, a 50-mirror reflection of everything he couldn't say. Rebecca Milliken finished the spiral because she'd spent their entire marriage learning to translate Howard's silences. She knew what the mirrors meant before she read a single page of his journal. She knew because she'd felt it too. The slow, terrible fading of mutual recognition, the way two people can live in the same house and become invisible to each other. The desperate hope that maybe if you just build something beautiful enough, the other person will finally see you again. They were both right, and they were both too late. Howard died believing the spiral was incomplete. Rebecca completed it believing Howard would never know. Two people reflecting each other across the gap of death, creating something beautiful out of catastrophic miscommunication. That's marriage sometimes. That's love. Imperfect mirrors, held together by hope and hardware, spiraling up towards light that neither person can quite reach. The mirrors still catch the sun every afternoon at 3:15. They throw 50 beams of light across the forest floor, illuminating patches of fern and fungus that would otherwise live in permanent shadow. Biologists have noted increased biodiversity in those illuminated spots. Rare moss species, unusual insect populations. The mirrors, it turns out, changed the ecosystem, created microclimates of light in a forest defined by darkness. Howard would have loved that. The idea that his monument to a failing marriage accidentally created new life, that his attempt to be seen ended up illuminating things that had always been invisible. That's the thing about reflection. You never know what else you'll catch in the light. Rebecca still hikes to the tree once a year. She still sits at the base, surrounded by reflected light. But she started bringing other things. Books Howard loved, seeds from their garden in San Francisco, once a recording of a song they danced to at their wedding. She plays it on a small speaker, lets it echo through the redwoods, and watches the mirrors throw light in 50 directions. She's never said whether she forgives him for disappearing into his work. She's never said whether she forgives herself for letting him disappear. Maybe forgiveness isn't the point. Maybe the point is that she keeps coming back, keeps sitting in the light he created, keeps reflecting. The case is officially closed. Howard Milliken, accidental death, no foul play, no conspiracy, just a man who climbed too high, reached too far and fell, and a woman who loved him enough to finish what he started, even though finishing it meant admitting she'd been looking in the wrong place all along. But there's one detail that still bothers the detectives who worked the case, one small thing that doesn't quite fit. When Rebecca was installing the final mirrors, she would have needed to climb to the top of the spiral. She would have needed to use the same routes, the same anchor points, the same techniques Howard used, which means she would have climbed higher than 80 feet, alone, without training, without safety equipment, in the early morning fog, for 3 consecutive days. When asked about this during a follow-up interview, Rebecca's answer was simple. She said, "I wasn't alone. Howard showed me where to put my hands. I know that sounds impossible. I know he was already gone, but I felt him there, in the rough bark under my palms, in the way the light hit each mirror at the exact right angle. He built the first 43 steps. I just followed him up. The detective didn't push further." What do you say to that? How do you fact-check grief? Rebecca climbed because she had to. She completed the spiral because leaving it unfinished would have been unbearable. And if she felt Howard guiding her hands, showing her the way up, who's to say she was wrong? The dead don't stop teaching us. They just teach in a different language. But for now, for this brief moment in geological time, the tree carries a human story. A story about visibility and invisibility. About the desperate things we do to be seen. About the lengths we'll go to finish what someone else started. About love that outlasts logic. Howard wanted to be reflected. He wanted Rebecca to see him again. He wanted to prove that even in darkness, light can find a way through. He built his proof one mirror at a time, climbing higher each day, positioning each piece with the precision of a man who believed that if he just got it right, everything else would fall into place. He was wrong, of course. The mirrors didn't save his marriage. They didn't bring Rebecca back. They didn't make him visible. He died alone on a rocky slope, and the spiral remained incomplete. But Rebecca finished it anyway. Not because it would change anything, not because Howard would know, but because finishing it was the last act of reflection she could offer. The last way to say, "I saw you. I see you still. You mattered. This mattered. Even if it's too late, even if we failed. Even if the only thing left is light bouncing off glass in an empty forest." That's the real mystery in the end. Not how the mirrors were installed after Howard was reported missing. Not why he built them in the first place. The real mystery is why Rebecca climbed that tree 3 times, risked her life, and never told anyone. The real mystery is what makes a person look at an unfinished monument to a broken marriage and decide, "I'll complete this, even though he's gone, even though it won't bring him back, even though no one will ever know I did it." The answer, perhaps, is that some promises outlast death. Some reflections continue even when the original source of light is gone. Some spirals have to be completed, not because they serve a purpose, but because leaving them unfinished would mean admitting that the love that inspired them was never real. And Rebecca couldn't admit that, wouldn't admit that, so she climbed, she drilled, she positioned mirrors according to a dead man's diagrams. She carved his message into the bark, she nailed his wedding ring above it, and then she stepped back and let the forest have its mystery. The sun sets earlier now in the redwoods. The autumn light comes in lower, sharper. The mirrors catch it differently these days. Instead of 50 distinct beams, they create a kind of shimmering net across the forest floor, a web of light, pulsing and shifting as the wind moves through the canopy. It's beautiful, it's strange. It's exactly the kind of thing Howard would have photographed and measured and tried to explain in his field journal. Rebecca saw it last October, during her annual visit. She sat at the base of the tree and watched the light net pulse and fade as the sun dropped below the ridgeline. She stayed until full dark, until the mirrors were just dim rectangles spiraling up into blackness, until the only light was the stars showing through gaps in the canopy. She didn't bring flowers that year. She didn't bring anything. She just sat, and before she left, she placed her hand flat against the carved message, traced the letters with her fingertips. "I'll keep reflecting. H," she whispered something. Maybe it was "I know." Maybe it was "I'm sorry." Maybe it was "Me too." No one heard it. The forest kept its secret. She hiked out by headlamp, 11 miles in the dark, alone. She knows the trail by heart now. She doesn't need the GPS anymore. She just walks, following the path that Howard walked 6 years ago, carrying mirrors and rope and a desperate hope that someone would see what he was building. At the trailhead, she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. She looked at the dark wall of trees. She thought about the spiral hidden somewhere in that darkness, still reflecting, still catching whatever light it could find, still keeping the promise carved into bark by 2 people who loved each other badly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Then she started the car. She drove back to San Francisco. She went to work the next morning. She lived her life. The way people do after tragedy. The way we all do. We keep moving. We keep reflecting. We bounce what light we can back into the world, even when we're not sure anyone's watching. The mirrors in Redwood National Park will fade eventually. The adhesive will fail. The metal will corrode. The spiral will disappear, absorbed back into the forest like everything else. Future generations will have no idea it was ever there. No idea that a man once climbed an ancient tree and tried to build a language out of reflected light. No idea that his wife finished his sentence after he died. But that's okay. Some stories aren't meant to last forever. Some monuments are meant to be temporary. The point isn't permanence. The point is that it existed at all. That two people tried. That love, even when it fails, even when it's too late, still finds ways to reflect itself back into the world. The mirrors prove it. 50 pieces of glass on an 800-year-old tree, a spiral of light in the darkness, a promise kept even after death, a message that reads, "I'll keep reflecting," and beneath it, invisible but true, another message, the one Rebecca carved into her own life by climbing that tree and finishing what Howard started, Me Too. 3 years after Howard's death, Marcus Chen returned to the mirrored tree. He'd graduated, taken a position with the Forest Service, and requested assignment to Redwood National Park specifically because he couldn't stop thinking about the spiral, about the man who'd built it, about the wife who'd finished it. Marcus had seen the crime scene photos. He'd read the reports, but something about the timeline still bothered him. The final mirrors weren't just functional. They were perfect. Each one angled with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of how light moved through that specific section of forest. Howard's notebook contained calculations, yes, but calculations alone couldn't account for the artistry of those final placements. He hiked to the tree on a Tuesday morning in late September. He'd brought equipment, a theodolite for measuring angles, a light meter, a camera. He wanted to document exactly what the mirrors were doing, because Marcus had a theory. He sat up at the base of the tree and waited. He watched the sun arc across the sky. He watched the mirrors catch and throw light across the forest floor, and slowly, as the afternoon progressed, he began to see it. The 50 beams of reflected light moved in a coordinated sequence. As the sun traveled west, the illuminated patches shifted in a deliberate progression, a wave of light, moving through the understory like a slow-motion searchlight, and the wave was pointing north, toward the exact location where Howard's body had been found. Marcus checked his compass. He checked the GPS coordinates from the investigation file. The alignment was perfect. The spiral of mirrors, when viewed as a complete system, created a directional arrow made of light, an arrow pointing to Howard. But Howard couldn't have known where his body would be found, which meant someone else had adjusted the mirrors, someone who knew where Howard was, someone who'd found him and then went back to finish the spiral. Rebecca. Marcus photographed everything. Then he did something he probably shouldn't have done. He looked up Rebecca Milliken's contact information. He called her. She answered on the third ring. When Marcus explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a long silence. Then she said, "I was wondering when someone would figure it out." They met 2 weeks later at a diner near the park entrance. Rebecca looked older than her photos, thinner, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She ordered coffee, didn't touch it. Marcus showed her his findings, the light pattern, the directional arrow, the precise alignment with Howard's death site. When he finished, Rebecca stared at the printed diagrams for a long time. Then she said, "Howard taught me how to read light. In the early days of our marriage, he'd take me into the forest and show me how shadows moved, how canopy gaps created lanes of illumination. He said understanding light was understanding time." She paused, sipped her coffee. "When I found his campsite, I read the notebook. The final 7 mirrors had GPS markers, but no angle calculations, just notes that said, 'Adjust by eye, trust the light.' So that's what I did. I positioned each mirror, and I adjusted by eye. I trusted the light." Marcus leaned forward. "Did you know where his body was?" Rebecca met his gaze. "Not consciously, but I knew where he would have gone. I knew how he thought. So when I was positioning the mirrors, I was thinking about him, walking in his mind. And the light just pointed. I didn't plan it. I didn't calculate it. I just let the mirrors show me where he was." "You found him before the search teams," Marcus said. Rebecca nodded. I found him 3 days before they did. I saw where the light was pointing. I followed it. I found him wedged between those rocks. I sat with him for 2 hours. I told him the spiral was beautiful, that I understood, that I was sorry. Then I hiked back out. I finished the last 2 mirrors, and I called the park service. Why didn't you tell them? Because if I told them I'd found him, they'd ask how. They'd figure out I'd been working on the tree. They'd know I'd been lying. And then they'd take it apart, treat it like evidence, dismantle what Howard built. I couldn't let that happen. Marcus absorbed this. What were the mirrors really for? Rebecca smiled. Sad. Genuine. They were for finding him, not his body. Him, the person he used to be. Howard spent so much time alone in the forest that he forgot how to be visible. The mirrors were his way of practicing, of being seen again. He wanted me to follow the light, to find him where he felt most himself. So he built a path made of light, and I followed it. The conversation lasted 3 more hours. Rebecca told Marcus about the climb, how terrifying it was, how she'd nearly fallen twice, how she'd heard Howard's voice in her head, telling her where to place her hands, how the final mirror had slipped from her grip and she'd caught it at the last second. Her heart hammered. She told him about the years since, the therapy, the grief, the slow process of building a life that didn't include Howard but still honored what they'd had. She said, people think closure means forgetting. It doesn't. It means learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. Marcus asked if she still visited the tree. Rebecca said yes, every year, always alone, always on October 13th, the day Howard died, the day she finished the spiral. She asked Marcus what he planned to do with his findings. He said he didn't know. He'd expected a story about obsession and tragedy. What he'd found was a story about 2 people learning to see each other again too late. Rebecca reached across the table. She put her hand on Marcus's research folder. She said, the mirrors are fading. In a few more years, they'll be gone completely. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some things are meant to be temporary, beautiful and broken and brief. Marcus left the diner with his folder still closed. He never published his findings. He filed his research in a drawer and went back to studying trees. But every year on October 13th, he hiked to the mirrored tree, not to take measurements, just to stand there, to watch the fading mirrors catch the afternoon light. Sometimes he saw Rebecca there. They never planned it. They'd nod at each other, sit on opposite sides of the tree, watch the light together in silence. Other times, Marcus was alone. The forest felt emptier then, but he'd stay the full hour anyway. He'd watch the light arrow point north. He'd think about Rebecca climbing this tree in the early morning fog, terrified and determined, finishing her husband's sentence. He'd think about how love isn't always enough, how sometimes people need to be seen, to be reflected, to know that when they speak, someone is listening. Howard built 50 mirrors because he'd forgotten how to ask for that simply. Rebecca finished them because she'd forgotten how to give it freely. The mirrors are almost gone now. The adhesive has failed on more than half. They lie scattered on the forest floor, cracked and tarnished, being absorbed by moss. The spiral is incomplete again, broken, returning to the forest piece by piece. But on clear October afternoons, when the sun hits at just the right angle, the remaining mirrors still catch light, still throw it north, still point toward the place where Howard Milliken died, thinking he'd failed, not knowing his wife was climbing toward him, finishing what he started, following light to find him one last time. Marcus understands now what he didn't understand 3 years ago. The mystery was never about how the mirrors were installed. It was about why we build monuments to things we've lost, why we complete other people's sentences, why we follow light into the forest even when we know what we'll find. We do it because we're human, because we need to believe that love means something even when it fails, that our attempts to be seen matter, even when no one's looking, that somewhere in the forest, light is bouncing off glass, pointing the way home to someone who'll never make the journey. Rebecca stopped visiting last year. Marcus heard she'd moved, left California, started over somewhere east. He hopes she's happy. He hopes she found someone who reflects her clearly, without requiring 50 mirrors and a death in the forest. But he still hikes to the tree every October 13th. He still watches the light, because someone should, because Howard and Rebecca built something that mattered, even if no one else knows it exists, even if it's disappearing. The mirrors taught Marcus something he hadn't learned in all his years studying trees, that visibility is temporary, that being seen is a gift, not a guarantee, that we should tell the people we love that we see them clearly and often before we lose the chance, before we're reduced to building monuments made of reflected light, hoping someone will understand what we meant. He stands at the base of the tree now, watching the last few mirrors catch the setting sun. He thinks about Howard, alone in his tent, writing calculations that were really love letters. He thinks about Rebecca, terrified and climbing, finishing sentences in a language she'd forgotten to speak. He thinks about all the ways we fail each other, and all the ways we try anyway. The light fades, the forest grows dark. Marcus turns on his headlamp and begins the long hike back. Behind him the mirrors go dim, waiting for morning, when the sun will rise again and the spiral, incomplete and failing, will throw its light north one more time, still pointing, still searching, still reflecting, even in the dark. The following spring, something unexpected happened. A graduate student from Berkeley stumbled upon the mirrored tree during an early morning survey. She posted photos online. Within 48 hours, the images had spread across social media. Thousands of people wanted to know the story behind the mysterious spiral. The Park Service issued a statement. They explained that the installation was created by a deceased researcher and his widow as a private memorial. They asked visitors to respect the site. They warned that the tree required an 11-mile hike through difficult terrain. It didn't work. Within weeks, dozens of people were making the trek. They came with cameras and journals. Some left flowers at the base. Others left notes, messages about love and loss and the people they'd failed to see clearly. The mirrored tree became something Howard never intended, a pilgrimage site. Marcus hiked out to assess the situation on a Saturday in April. The trail had been worn wider by foot traffic. Someone had created an improvised guest book, a waterproof box chained to a nearby stump. Marcus opened it, read the entries. "My husband stopped seeing me years before he left. I wish I'd built something like this. I came here to remember my daughter. She wanted to be a scientist like the man who made this. To whoever finished these mirrors, you're braver than I was. I never finished what my father started." The messages went on for pages, all variations on the same theme. People who'd loved someone and lost them. People who'd failed to communicate until it was too late. People who saw their own story reflected in Howard and Rebecca's tragedy. Marcus sat with the guest book for an hour. He thought about calling Rebecca, telling her what the tree had become, but he decided against it. She'd moved on. She'd earned her peace, but the story shouldn't end with Rebecca disappearing and the mirrors fading. Marcus realized what Howard had actually achieved, not saving his marriage, but creating a place where people could confront their own failures to see and be seen. Marcus began documenting the site properly. He cataloged every remaining mirror. He photographed the guest book entries. He interviewed visitors. What he discovered was that the mirrored tree had become a modern shrine to the universal human experience of miscommunication and regret. One woman told him she'd driven from Portland after her divorce. She said, "I needed to see proof that other people tried as hard as we did and still failed. It made me feel less alone." A man in his 60s brought his estranged adult son. They'd sat at the base together in silence for 2 hours. Afterward, they'd started talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Marcus realized what had happened. Howard had tried to build a bridge to one person. Instead, he'd built a bridge to thousands. His failure to save his marriage had accidentally created something that helped others save theirs. The Park Service eventually installed a formal trail to the mirrored tree. They added it to maps. The tree that Howard wanted only Rebecca to find had become one of the most visited locations in the backcountry. Marcus wrote a paper about accidental memorials, places that become sacred not because of what they were intended to be, but because of what people need them to be. His paper got attention. NPR did a segment. Through all of it, Marcus never mentioned Rebecca by name. He protected her privacy the way she'd protected Howard's vision. He never revealed that she'd found Howard's body before the search teams. Some mysteries deserve to stay buried. The answer came on October 13th, 5 years after Howard's death. Marcus made his annual pilgrimage. When he arrived, Rebecca was already there, sitting at the base, reading entries in the guest book, tears streaming down her face. They didn't speak at first, just sat together, watching the fading mirrors catch the afternoon light. Finally, Rebecca said, "He would have hated this. All these people, all this attention. He wanted it to be private." Marcus waited. Then Rebecca smiled. Small, sad, real. "But I think he would have loved what it means, that all these people are trying." Howard spent his whole life studying how trees communicate, how they send signals through darkness. Maybe this is his signal, still sending, still reaching people he never met. She closed the guest book, stood, looked at Marcus. "Thank you for protecting the story." Then she walked away, north, following the light arrow one last time. Marcus watched her disappear into the trees. He never saw her again. The mirrors are almost gone now. Another few years, and they'll all be on the forest floor. But the guest book remains, growing thicker every year, filled with promises and confessions that people couldn't say anywhere else. Howard Milliken wanted to build a bridge to his wife. Instead, he built a bridge between loneliness and connection, between silence and speech, between the person we are and the person someone else needs us to be. The tree still stands, 800 years old, barely scarred by the 50 mirrors that briefly decorated its trunk, indifferent to human drama, growing toward light the way trees always have. But on clear October afternoons, if you know where to look, you can still see faint glints of reflected light, still pointing north, still showing the way to something that was lost and lost again, still reflecting, even in the dark, especially in the dark. That's what Howard taught us. That's what Rebecca completed. That's what thousands of visitors have learned at the base of an ancient tree, 11 miles from anywhere. We are most visible when we reflect each other, and we are never truly lost as long as someone keeps looking.